We should be seeing a countdown. Okay, there we go. Now we're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to part 6, the final part of the mini-series Colorism in the Workplace. I am Dr. Sarah Webb, and I'm joined by Carlynn Greene. We're going to wrap up this 6-part mini-series by talking about how we can continue the conversation on colorism. And before I allow Carlynn to introduce herself, I just want to kind of recap what the series has been about. For anyone who's missed it, you can go back and catch the replay of the first 5 episodes on my LinkedIn page or YouTube page. But essentially, what colorism is a social stratification. It's a social hierarchy where people with lighter skin tones and more European features are pushed to the top of the hierarchy, and people with darker skin tones are pushed to the bottom of the social hierarchy. And that definitely impacts the way we show up in the workplace, the experiences we have at work or at school, or just in the larger society. And so that's what we've been unpacking. But today we're going to kind of talk about what can we do? How can we continue this conversation beyond just the 6-week live series? And yes, this has been part of the LinkedIn Creator Accelerator program, and we're in the final week. So I'm kind of sad. It's been a great 10 weeks, but I think this is a great way to wrap things up, doing a collaboration with one of my fellow First 100s, Carlynn Greene. So I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself to the audience, tell them about what you do, what your background is, and a little bit about why you care about colorism.
Yes, so hi everyone. As far as my background, I'm currently a graduate student studying PR, public relations. And as far as my content that enabled me to be a part of the LinkedIn Creator Accelerator program, I focus on giving students like scholarship advice. Over the years, I've won 30 for my own education, debt-free for 2 degrees, undergrad, grad school. So I'm just teaching others how to emulate my strategies and graduate debt-free as well. And somewhat of a fun fact on how I got started with this journey of helping people with what I do. The very first scholarship I won was basically like a trauma-based essay application, and I was talking about my experience with colorism. So the fact that Dr. Webb here has created a platform and a community of people who struggle with colorism like I did for a whole decade, like from the time I was 8 to 18, it took away my childhood, is very, very important. So thank you for what you're doing.
Yes, definitely. Also, just congrats to you on all the scholarships you've won. I think I saw some of your TikTok and Instagram content, and I was like, oh, wow. I think this generation is very fortunate to be able to have access to that kind of information. I think when I was going to college, you had to go to the library and look at print books and like search through volumes of things and like almanacs and things like that. So the fact that, people like you are making that content more available so that college is more accessible in this country to more people, super great and awesome. So I kind of want to go into here a little bit more, because you talked about just now that colorism has definitely impacted you personally. Are you open to or willing to share a little bit more about what that looked like for you?
Yes, so it started when I was about 8 years old. And the thing about colorism in comparison to racism is that with colorism, it's typically discrimination that's happening within your own racial group, which in my opinion can be even more, make more of a psychological impact on you because these are the people you would, expect to be on your side, right? And sometimes it can even come from family members like it was in my case. So when you're getting like outcasted and bullied by family friends of the same race, it really does a lot on you mentally, like it did for me. For years, I used to walk around with my back hunched over and didn't make eye contact with people. And that's probably part of the reason why I still am somewhat, still suffer from like social anxiety and things. It's like an after effect of that. So that was my experience with that. And I was even on the tennis team in middle school, way before that, even back when I was 8 years old. But then I suddenly quit playing, even though I was like one of the best players on the team, because I was insecure about my skin getting darker from being out in the sun. So I talked about all these things in that scholarship that I won, the very first one. It was a local opportunity. And the scholarship was what was scholarship prompt was, what does beauty and brains mean to you? And so I talked about that, reminisced on that, and I ended up winning. But over time, I wasn't comfortable talking about my trauma over and over again to these scholarship committees of people who don't even know me. So I make sure that with my content that I emphasize to people that you can win scholarships without talking about or oversharing about traumatic things in your life.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. And so the personal aspects of colorism are definitely something that we need to talk about, and that I think the starting sometimes with the personal level can help raise awareness, and people can gain that initial interest in the topic in terms of hearing someone they work with or someone they go to school with, or a neighbor on the street or a partner that they're involved with having invested interest in just learning more about their personal story. But it's also important, I think, for people to look at the systemic impacts of colorism and how that personal impact has ripple effects elsewhere in society. And I'm curious to know what do you think is the reason that, not just on an individual level, but in terms of at the institutional level, at a school, for example, or at the company-wide level, why should people care about colorism as a whole and not just necessarily at the individual level?
Because, well, with colorism, it addresses a lot of people's implicit biases. Like a lot of times when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we talk about racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. But I'm glad that you're bringing into the conversation colorism, because that is so important. There's been research conducted that shows that people with darker skin tones are less likely to get paid more or get higher executive positions at a certain company. So this topic needs to be discussed more. And it's not just a matter of, because sometimes people like to dwindle down the conversation of colorism of where it's just a matter of like preference and attractiveness, but it's so much more than that.
Hmm. Yeah. So I am getting a little interference with the connection. I hope you, am I coming through okay for you
Yes, you are.
in terms of, okay. All right, cool. I'm in the Airbnbs these days, and so I don't control the Wi-Fi where I am. So it's always like just fingers crossed. Um, But I want to kind of speak to some of what you said, and harkening back to some of the previous conversations that we've had, right? And my very first guest, who was my biological sister, who is lighter skinned than I am, and just in terms of defining colorism, that episode was really about letting people know that someone can be the same race, the same exact race, and yet have different skin tones, and that there are people of different races who have the same skin tone. And so we have often culturally over collapsed or over identified color with race and kind of made those things synonyms when they aren't necessarily synonyms. And I think it's important, just to kind of recap the series, since this is the final conversation for the live mini series on colorism in the workplace, is for people to remember that a lot of times the way Mexicans or Chinese people or Indian people experience racism, or even experience other forms of oppression like sexism, or the way they experience classism or casteism. A lot of that is impacted or influenced by the particular skin tone that they have, or the particular hair part of intersectionality, right? We talk about how it's not just one facet of your identity that impacts your experience at work, for example, but it's the collection of all those facets, and they can have variable influences. And so, as you mentioned, there has been research done for decades across different races of people and different ethnic groups of people in different parts of the world that show the disparities in educational outcomes, for example. And the second episode, and a little bit in the third episode of this mini series, we talked about how amongst African American girls in school, right? And so kind of relevant to what you're talking about in the realm of education and schooling, African American girls with very dark skin, they were 3 times more likely to be suspended from school than African girls with very light skin tones, despite having similar GPAs, despite having similar socioeconomic backgrounds, despite having similar prior infractions or behavioral records, right? And so I think that we see, even in terms of the workplace, the research on disparities in income, the lighter your skin tone is, the less the wage gap is, and the darker your skin tone is, the wider the wage gap is, right? And so I think, a lot of times we can put these statistics out there and people are shocked. A lot of people know about racial inequality, and very few people are aware that there's inequality and racial disparities within people or amongst people of the same race. And so I'm kind of curious to think, why do you think there is not as much awareness about colorism? Or what do you think is keeping people from progressing the conversation forward, right? So our topic is continuing the conversation. But do you have thoughts on what stops people from talking about colorism in the first place?
I think the main thing is the lack of accountability. Because when you talk about things like racism, and like as a Black person, let's say you talk about racism coming from white people or other ethnic groups, that's putting like the blame, the the responsibility on a different group, as opposed with colorism, you're basically putting that responsibility on people within your own community, so people are less likely to talk about it. I think that's the main reason. And speaking on what you were saying earlier about colorism in education, my sophomore year of college, back when I was majoring in broadcast journalism, I went back to my old high school. My old high school used to bully me all the time for my darker skin tone. I went back to my old high school to interview my college counselor for a story I was doing. And while I was in the hallway getting B-roll for my story, these two students just walked by me and they were like, look at this dark African bitch. And then they start doing some stereotypical African clicking sounds. So seeing that like 2 years after I had already graduated was shocking, but at the same time not surprising, because that was the environment, the school district that I grew up in and had to face all the time. So yes, colorism needs to be talked about. I feel like they need to implement it more into like therapy. I believe you go into that as well, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So one, I want to say that I am sorry to hear about those experiences that you've had. And so many people have testified or have similar testimonies in that regard, in educational settings. So I agree. I think therapists, but also school counselors, teachers, school administrators, deans and principals, and school social workers have to be aware, one, that they aren't perpetuating colorism, but also that amongst the students that they serve, whether it be at the K-12 level or at the collegiate level, right, which is a lot of where your focus is in terms of scholarships, but even, people being aware that amongst students, they're dealing with these things, right? And it's definitely African American students, but it could be students of any race or color that are dealing with these sort of this particular brand of bullying, this particular form of ostracization and alienation. But thank you for sharing that. Don't forget that we are, wrapping up a series on colorism in the workplace. And so, in terms of continuing the conversation, I'd like to hear from all of you who are watching live. Even if you're watching the recording, you could always leave a comment. But what are some of your overall arching questions around colorism, whether it generally or colorism in the workplace specifically? And so I want to go to some of these questions. Hey, hello, LinkedIn users. I can't see everyone's names. Sydney S said, it ain't colorism, it is racism. Let's keep it a buck. I think keeping it a buck, Sydney, is acknowledging that colorism is real and that it's just as important to talk about as racism. I think that's keeping it a buck. Says, are you not allowed to say anti-Black racism? We're allowed to say anti-Black racism. We're also allowed to say colorism. We're also allowed to say texturism. We're also allowed to say featurism. Let's see. In the workplace, it doesn't matter. It does matter. Go look at the research. So comments like what Sydney is saying is the reason why
Yeah,
it's hard to progress the conversation around colorism, is because people are in denial that it's
the
a real thing,
gaslighting.
just like racism and sexism. And so, as I mentioned, there have been research studies done for decades that prove that African Americans with lighter skin tone earn more money, get hired more, are seen as more intelligent, are less likely to be profiled and killed and murdered by cops. And as I mentioned, African American girls with darker skin tones being more likely to be suspended from school. So this denial is very similar to what white people do when they don't believe that racism is a thing. So you hear white people saying, "Oh no, we're all human. I don't see color. Are you sure you're not being too sensitive? You're making that up." So Sydney, I'm sorry to say, but you are doing exactly what white people do in conversations around racism and being in denial, and it's not helpful. So yeah, we're gonna move on from that. But Alicia says, "I'm sorry you went through that." Shows of support from Zephrine, who also says that school was full of trauma. Let's see. Another LinkedIn user says, families treat kids differently too. If you look like your daddy, you're done." Yeah. So I think it's important to, as you're saying, Carlynn, is that a lot of the colorism comes from our own families who learned it through the larger society, but then we internalize it and perpetuate our own children. And sometimes it's done from a place of seeming love, right? Or I want you to have a better life than I had, but it can still be harmful and create a lot of division amongst families as well. So thank you all for your comments and participation, even though I have to disagree vehemently with some of the comments. So I also am curious to know, Carlynn, for people who are interested in learning more about colorism and continuing the conversation, what are some strategies that people can take in order to, I think, help raise awareness, help to start raising awareness if they're listening to this and they want to either learn more or they want to continue the conversation within their own circles? What are some advice or strategies you have for people in order to do that?
Well, first and foremost, I would encourage them to follow you and your content, because I was actually following you years before the LinkedIn program. So I was already familiar with all of what you do. So thank you for that. It helped me with my journey. And then as outside of that, it does help to be a part of like groups. I remember during my junior or senior year of college, a friend of mine who was in grad school, she was doing a focus group on how people were impacted by colorism. She was writing her thesis on it. I can share it with you later if I can get in contact with her about that. But that was really eye-opening for me and a very emotional experience, because I had never taken the time to speak on this. I always spoke on it to, like, you know, close friends, close family, but not to people who didn't already know me or not. Whereas in the past, it was just like in a written format as opposed to being spoken. So that can help. Oh gosh, I just keep stuttering. But I follow a lot of content on social media like Instagram and YouTube of fellow Black women who are dark skinned, and influencers and celebrities who are dark skinned, like um, what's her name? Ryan Destiny, Normani, all these people, for constant inspiration to remind myself yet again that I am beautiful, that I am worthy of existing. And that's another thing. The thing about like racism and colorism, you've probably heard, oh, the sun, you probably heard how with racism, there have been some cases of students or people in general who committed suicide or attempted to commit suicide because they were bullied for being their race. Well, the same thing has happened for colorism. I remember there was this one person at my church who, not my church, another church close to ours, they committed suicide because of the insecurity they had with their dark skin. And when I was younger, I attempted to do the same when I was like 12 or 13. Of course, I'm still here, so it failed. But that's another thing that people need to talk about. This is a very, very serious matter, and it can take a huge toll on your mental health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, one, thank you for that vulnerability and sharing that. And hopefully, people who hear it will seek help and seek support. And I think one of my hopes too, in bringing the conversation around colorism forward, is that people feel seen and they have the awareness or the recognition that maybe they can speak out and reach out to someone, because I do know so many of the people who talk to me or respond to me with colorism say they've never been able to talk to somebody about it. They've never felt like anyone would listen, and I felt like that as a younger person too. And so I think regardless of what people ultimately do, I think just seeing that someone else sees them can make a difference, right? And knowing that you're not alone. But I do encourage people to reach out to someone, right? Especially professionals if you have access and resources in that regard. Um, but yeah, I think there's a need to treat colorism with urgency. As Alicia is saying here in this comment, give it the same energy that we give when we're talking about racism, because the impact is the same. The impact, the outcome is just as deadly and just as detrimental and just as harmful in the material sense as well as in the psychological sense. Um, so we have a couple of other questions coming through here. Let's see. Hi, Michael. I have a Euro face with darker skin tone. It's an interesting avatar to operate. All the best to everyone on this journey called life. Yeah, I think kind of what Michael is talking about, I'll put it on the screen, is featurism and colorism, right? And so having the Euro face, maybe having a thinner nose, even a light thinner lips are just a facial form that we associate with Europeans versus having a darker skin tone. And so again, that goes back to that intersectionality piece. There's always more than one thing impacting our experience. There's always more than just one facet of what we look like or how we show up that can have an impact on how we navigate the world. So thank you for sharing that. Zephrine says it really does take a toll on your mental health. Thank you, Carlynn Greene, for sharing. And I see you. Yes. And I think exchanges like this are so important, like that human to human exchange of acknowledgement. So I'm making space. I'm allowing for that to just kind of marinate and across the airwaves a little bit. Alicia says, Zephrine Hanson, I'm sorry you experienced this. I truly hate colorism just as much as racism. Yes. Thank you all again for engaging. Whether it's, affirmative or just posing challenging questions, we have to talk about it, even when it gets uncomfortable, even when we get pushback, even when we disagree sometimes. It's better to have the conversation than to ignore it for the sake of avoiding those forms of discomfort. And the level of vulnerability that Carlynn, that you're sharing, as well as people just in the comments being able to hold space for your vulnerability, I think that's a beautiful thing. And so in terms of continuing the conversation, you mentioned a few things, being part of groups, right? I do think that one thing that inspires me is I'm seeing younger people talking about colorism way more than my generation ever did. Again, when I was in high school, we didn't even have the language to talk about it. And in 2022, I get emails every so often from high school students doing presentations and writing papers and essays and doing group projects on it. And so I think I do see a change, an increase in that awareness. But in terms of, and then, you're a little younger than me, but when you look to the future, when you look ahead, what is your hope in terms of this issue of colorism? What do you hope for your generation or just the world at large when it comes to this issue?
I hope that people can learn to be self-aware of their own biases and not take things to heart of where like it's just pointing the fingers at them. Like learn from your mistakes, learn from how you judge others, whether that's consciously or unconsciously. And also, I hope that with this conversation that we're bringing to attention for colorism, as it continues to expand, that the industry, the skin bleaching industry, can drastically go down. That was another thing when I was younger. I tried doing that. Of course, that failed because I still have this lovely dark skin of mine. But the skin bleaching industry is like a multi-billion-dollar industry, especially in Asia and like parts of Africa as well. It's so sad. And you see all these ads of people depicting like a darker skinned woman or darker skinned man looking miserable within their life, and then suddenly they get access to skin bleaching cream or treatment, and then suddenly they have all these connections and relationships and they're happy. So it just, the thing about lighter skin, how it's depicted in society and media in general, it typically associates it with positive aspects of life, and then darker skin with negative aspects of life, when in reality, no matter your skin tone, you can have a positive or negative experience. So I just hope that, again, once we continue to expand this conversation, not only in the Black community, but also in other ethnic groups as well, that the industry can just honestly go bankrupt. Um, but yes, that's my thoughts on that.
Yes. Well, thank you for that, because that is a very concrete, tangible hope, right? That we can bankrupt a particular industry, that we can, I've seen some petitions, and I've seen like initiatives to ban and create policies where they can't advertise skin bleaching creams, right? And so wanting to take down the advertisements. And so I think even that goal, there could even be like smaller goals within that, or like steps, milestones that people can work towards to see the larger goal happen. And again, whether it be not advertising them on like public broadcasting channels, or I don't really know the technical details of that, but it's definitely, it sounds like something concrete and something that people can actually like get behind and rally themselves around. Yeah, thank you. Michael is saying it is beautiful. Thank you for your work, Dr. Webb and Carlynn Greene. Thank you for being here, Michael, and for your work as well over at the University of Phoenix, my good friends over there. And then Alicia says, skin bleaching is just horrid and needs to disappear. Yeah. And I think the industry, the whole marketing behind it. Bill Duke, one of the producers of the Dark Girls documentary, said that the way you were born is fine, and anyone who tells you it's not is either a liar or a salesperson, right? And so it's kind of like the industry promotes the media images that make you feel less than, and then they create products and sell it to you so that you can feel better, right? And so they definitely benefit from the marketing of lighter skin as being associated with positive attributes. Yeah, so before we go, if anyone else has final questions or thoughts, I just want to thank you, Carlynn. I want to thank those who are watching live. But since this is the last of the live series, I also want to thank, in retrospect, all of my other guests and all of the people who have tuned in live or watched the replay either on LinkedIn or YouTube. And I also just want to thank people who have, engaged and have participated in the conversation, because it's so necessary. I appreciate anyone who just has paid attention to this conversation in some way, whether it be big or small. And I hope that we can grow and build on that. But before we let the good folks go for, well, the series, so bittersweet. Do you have like any other final thoughts or like big takeaways? And then also, how can people keep in touch with you and follow your work, especially if they are interested in maybe helping their children get college scholarships someday or that sort of thing?
I guess I'll first say my contact information and then the biggest takeaways. You can contact me at my last name, first name, greencarlin@gmail.com. And then there's my website, scholarship-guru.com. If you need financial aid assistance for college, whether that's for you or your students, your kids. And then as far as the biggest takeaways from this, at the end of the day, when it comes to colorism, and just about any other form of discrimination, you have to learn to seek out resources to enable your growth and to enable self-love, because sometimes those resources are not necessarily readily available for you. You got to actively look for them, actively research them, find these research studies, find these YouTubers, content creators, whoever, who look like you, because the more you see yourself represented, the more you will know that you too are worthy of existing.
Yes, beautiful. Thank you so much for your nuggets of wisdom, for your time, for your work, um, particularly, the work, your day-to-day work of helping again to make education more accessible for folks. Yeah, so I don't see any other questions coming up in the chat, so we'll let folks go. But just know that we will be continuing this conversation, even though we're wrapping up for tonight and wrapping up for this live mini series. Definitely link up, follow us, and we'll be talking about it again and actually doing stuff. Also, I would also say too, like if you reach out to me, I can talk to you more about upcoming support groups and coaching for anyone who wants a little bit more support on their healing journey as well. But definitely, at the very least, share this particular conversation with someone who might be interested in it. Thank you all so much, and Carlynn, I hope you enjoy the rest of your week.
Yes, thank you for having me. Bye.